Welcome to my house. I hope that everyone's doing well. This is going to be a short presentation about grounded theory and a brief overview of it. Okay. In this presentation, we'll be covering the following things: what is grounded theory, history of grounded theory, a few distinctive points, how participant sampling happens, how coding happens, the importance of constant comparison, theoretical saturation, research memos, and finally, why I'm going to choose to do grounded theory. So what is grounded theory? Grounded theory is a qualitative constructionist approach to doing research. Okay? It is based off an idea called symbolic interactionism, where people make meaning in their lives through social interactions. Grounded theory is a method to develop a brand new theory that is grounded in the data that you collect in context from the participants of your study. It has various strengths, as I listed in the slide, and it uses various techniques to acquire data, including in-depth interviewing, life and oral histories, ethnographies, document analysis, or a combination of all these methods. Okay. So a quick history about grounded theory. Grounded theory was developed by a guy named Glaser, right here, and Strauss, way up there. Okay, and Glaser and Strauss worked in a hospital studying end-of-life care in the United States. They published their original work of how grounded theory was to work in 1967. Glaser and Strauss came from two very different backgrounds. Glaser was a scientist and a positivist, and Strauss was a constructivist with an emphasis on agency. Eventually, Glaser and Strauss went their separate ways, and Strauss started publishing with a different person named Corbin about how he saw, or they saw, grounded theory working. And then Glaser also published some different viewpoints of how grounded theory is supposed to work, and there was a little bit of argumentation about how grounded theory was supposed to work actually between the two groups. Later on, though, yeah, the lady over there, okay, way over there, Kathy Sharmaz in the 1990s put a third kind of approach onto how grounded theory is supposed to work in response to some postmodernistic criticisms of grounded theory, because a lot of people thought it was very positivistic in its approach. There are other minor kind of like theories and ideas about how grounded theory methodology works, but these are the major three. So because there's three different researchers, there's also three major design types for grounded theory, and that is the systematic design that's developed by Strauss and Corbin, the emergent design as supported by Glaser, and the constructivist design as proposed by Sharmaz. For the purposes of this particular presentation, I'm going to focus on Strauss and Corbin's systematic design to grounded theory. I just find it clearly laid out and it fits my context. So what makes grounded research kind of really distinct from other forms of research is that grounded theory is an approach that looks at interactions among people around a particular topic. Sharmaz described it as an emphasis on a process, that is grounded research theory, around the centrality of a storyline, which the analysis can kind of coalesce together, right? Grounded theory also can generate theories which is different than other qualitative methods because data or theories are not really discovered per se, but instead Sharmaz claims that we are part of the world that we study and the data that we collect as well. Now, grounded theory uses a three-step system that takes data and generates a theory, and open, axial, and selective coding are listed right there. So what's happening there is that we are using inductive and deductive reasoning, and we're forming that kind of together into something called abductive reasoning to generate our new theory for us. Okay, and ground theory uses theoretical sampling and pays special attention to something called theoretical saturation, which we will explore later on. I did end up reading a paper by Popowicz. Sorry, I probably really messed up that name. But anyways, this lady gave a really cogent argument about warning new grounded theory researchers and warning them that if you read too much into the theories, the pre-existing theories that exist out there, that you might be tempted, as Creswell says, to borrow one off the shelf and simply apply to your situation, whereas grounded theories is really supposed to work by using the data that you get and forming a brand new theory from that data. So as far as participant sampling goes, ground theory uses something called theoretical sampling. That is, the researcher goes out and finds participants that would have interesting points of view about this one central idea that you're trying to find, this core category, if you will. And the source of the data can include observations, conversations, interviews, public records, diaries, and even the researcher's own personal reflections or their memos. And how we go about aiming this these questions and finding new participants is by allowing the researchers to analyze the data as soon as you have some. You go out, you find some data, you analyze it right away, and that analysis helps you to plan out your next step. Now we're getting to open coding. So this is the first step in a kind of an interesting analysis approach by Strauss and Corbin's systematic design. This first step of the aim, basically, of open coding is to form initial categories for your information. So basically what you do is you go out there, you get some data, interviews, whatever have you, and then once you have this data, you bring it back and you dissect it. You microanalyze the thing. If you have something like interviews or textual data, you take it apart word by word or line by line and you code that. If you have something like a narrative or an ethnography data, then you take it apart segment by segment and you analyze that. Basically, what you're trying to do is you're taking apart the data to explore all the possible meanings between the different bits of information to try and identify new relationships between these events or these interactions. And it's a new way of linking and portraying these relationships, right? You then group these data into categories and name the category according to the concept. Creswell has even suggested that you can do something called in vivo labels, which is basically you use the words that the participants used as the label to the category itself. The second step to this coding process is something called axial coding, and this is a lot more conceptual than the open coding. Basically, what axial coding is asking to do is take the data and put it back together again and to make connections between the categories themselves. What you need to do is you look at all the categories and you find one category that seems to be what we call a core category. All right. This core category basically has a relationship between this. It seems like it's central to your theme or to your theory, and all the other categories can relate to it. You can also find this core category by looking at the frequency of its occurrence, its quick and easy saturation, or its clear implications for the development of your theory. These relationships, or basically how these categories can relate to each other with respect to the core category, that is, can be causal, contextual, intervening strategies, or consequences, right? This is where Strauss and Corbin's systematic design is, what I've presented here, is a little bit disagreed upon by Glaser. Is that Glaser feels that this axial coding is takes categories and forces them into a relationship when they not necessarily have to be in this type of relationship. And he proposes something called theoretical coding that takes all the fractured data and weaves it together. This last step of the coding process is something called selective coding. And selective coding is where you actually generate the theory itself. So you take this process you've already developed in the axial coding, and you basically come up with a theory. And this theory will become an abstract explanation or understanding of the process about the topic that's grounded in the data itself. And this theory can be developed as a visual diagram, as in the previous slide, or as a written narrative format sort of thing. Again, selective coding uses something called abductive reasoning, right, around the core category, and your core category becomes the main theme of your research. The whole idea of this thing is to take all the categories that you have collected and unify it around one core category to create your kind of theory. This idea of constant comparison is actually quite important in grounded theory, and it's quite different from the other qualitative work. Basically, the other qualitative work has you finish your field work, collect all your data, and then go home and analyze it all at once. Grounded theory is not like that. Basically, what grounded theory tells you to do is to go out there into the field, collect some data, bring it back, analyze it right away, and that allows you to aim your next set of questions. You go out, you collect more data, you come back, you analyze it some more, you focus on your questions yet again, and you go out and you ask your third set of questions. And you keep on doing this process because this helps you in something like your axial coding, in looking at the questions around your central process, and also helps you eliminate the redundancies, and it provides you evidence for your categories as well as connecting your categories. But actually, most importantly, what this constant comparison allows you to do is look to see if your data set or your data set has reached saturation, or if you have reached theoretical saturation. This idea of theoretical saturation was kind of interesting to me, so I looked into it a little bit more. Strauss and Glaser in 1967 kind of looked at this process and called it something called theoretical saturation. And what theoretical saturation essentially means is that once you have collected some data, you keep on going out and you try really hard to find alternative kind of perspectives upon your core kind of theory or core category, and you can't find any more. Any new perspectives you think are going to be new perspectives, any new data you provide, just gives you the same feedback that you already have in your theoretical framework. All right? This is going to be a little different than something called data saturation. And Liamputtong, 2013, kind of says that there is a mistake that sometimes some researchers make, is that they mistaken something called theoretical saturation, which is the end of your study sort of thing, for data saturation, which is completely different. So I looked it up in Saunders in 2018, and basically Saunders said, again, we are aiming for something called theoretical saturation, not data saturation. So what theoretical saturation is that is when your core category is saturated and there's no more new data that can offer alternative perspectives upon your core category itself. Whereas data saturation relates to the degree which new data repeats itself expressed in the previous data. So basically, same people are saying the same things. Just because different people are saying the same things does not mean that you have reached something called theoretical saturation. You just have data saturation at that point. This idea of research memos is kind of interesting because It is a metacognitive tool that allows the grounded researcher to interact with the data or the participants or the categories themselves. So basically what we're going to do is that the researcher is going to go out, and as kind of hunches and ideas and concepts kind of leap into their head, what we're going to do is we're going to write them down as a researcher memo. And the purpose of these things is to basically deconstruct and reconstruct some of the data. And in that way, how we formed our categories become a little bit more clear. And more importantly, way more importantly, is that you are able to find some of the gaps in your data set so that you can reach theoretical saturation. Now, before I explain why I have chosen to use ground theory for my proposed study, I'm going to go through some of the drawbacks first. It makes more sense this way. Anyways, grounded theory has been criticized because of its bias and the agency, the really, really strong agency of the researcher. That's almost built into the system. It's kind of unavoidable, I think. And there's also no standardized way to identify what a category actually is. Sometimes the grounded theory can also produce a large amount of data that can become rather unwieldy. And also, it's a qualitative study technique. And qualitative studies have its own set of problems, especially with something like data subjectivity and the importance of establishing reliability and validity. So now I'm going to get to the reason why I'm choosing to use grounded theory for my proposed study. And just as a reminder, my topic is to find the factors that influence the academic motivation of Chinese and Filipino immigrant students. Now, grounded theory offers me a wide range of supports for my proposed study that I find very valuable. First of all, it is a qualitative approach. I simply don't have the logistical power, nor the time, nor the money to pull off a statistically significant quantitative study. So let's go with the qualitative one. Plus, I think that an idea that I read in Liamputtong's book was that what might be true for one person or a cultural group may not be true for yet another, which I think is really relevant in my case because even though I'm a Chinese immigrant, my reality doesn't necessarily have to be the same reality as newer immigrants of Chinese origin or that of my Filipino demographic. My immigration experience could be very different from theirs. And I wanted a theory that was grounded in the data itself because I think that the people who have kind of lived through this experience, gone through the process of trying to educate their kids and trying to get them to motivate to study a little bit more and study harder to fight for that dream, they are the ones that are actually experiencing these things. So they should be the best source of data for my study. And grounded theory allows me to use that data to form a specific theory. Another really good thing about how grounded theory works is that it's able to generate its own theory and not borrow one off the shelf like Creswell kind of suggested. I've done a very limited amount of reading. We all have. So far, I've run across a few theories, and they've been kind of interesting. But there's no theory that really fits the specific list of variables I'm seeing. I could list them, but that's kind of boring for you guys right now. That's beyond the point of this video. So anyways, I like the idea that I can use the the variables that I'm seeing in my context and form my own theory that is very specific to this particular situation, particular context. This method also uses a theoretical sampling coupled with in-depth interviews, life and oral histories, and it employs continuous comparison at the same time. I really like this approach because I think I have a pretty good understanding of the immigrant Chinese kind of experience, but I am lacking in knowledge for the Filipino culture. So I want an adaptable kind of process whereby I can go out, get some data, come home, analyze it, find out what I'm missing, find out what's wrong with my research design, and adjust it on the fly, and then go out next day and gather more data and then bring it back and analyze that. So I'm just a lot more adaptable that way. And I think the in-depth interviews and this whole constant comparison kind of business can really produce a clearer picture of what is actually happening. This last point that I have on here about the transformative feminist approach is kind of interesting because I'm going to try my best to bring in some of the feminist research approach into this situation because I want to give voice to people that are underrepresented. Now, Chinese students and Chinese populations are a little bit underrepresented in Canada, I think. However, the Filipino population has been severely underrepresented, and there is quite a underlying crisis, I think, that's happening with this particular demographic, and I want to explore why that's happening. So as a result, this feminist approach might be able to give voice to some of these populations and find out what's going on. So now that we come to the end of this presentation, I want to explain what all the flowers are about. These lovely flowers have been drawn by a lady named Katie Park, and all throughout this presentation on the side here, she's been teaching you guys how to draw these three lovely tulips. And I thought this is kind of an interesting metaphor for how grounded theory works because it is a participant that is providing the data to us. And what's happening here is that, like the researcher, you go out, you find a little bit of data, you bring it back, you analyze a whole bunch, and then you go out, you find more data, you bring it back, you analyze a whole bunch, and you keep on doing this process back and forth a lot to generate this overall kind of picture to see how these three flowers relate to each other or how these three categories relate to each other to form this overall theory. I thought it was a kind of an interesting metaphor. So besides all the technicalities of how grounded theory works and is supposed to work, and all the theories and all the research and everything else, I took a little bit of a different perspective on this last bit. I really put myself in the shoes of a potential participant. As some of you guys might or might not know, my mom and I were at one point refugees to this country, and then immigrants, and now we're citizens, but we have gone through this process that I am potentially going to study. So I thought, if a researcher came into my context, into my life, and wanted to interview us, how would I want them to treat my mom and myself? Well, I would have wanted someone to take the time to ask her and myself about how this process took place, and I didn't want her to be treated like another statistic. I wanted her experience to be humanized, and I wanted the researcher to really take the time to understand our perspectives and the decisions we made and the context that we were in. So I thought that if a grounded theory researcher came in and wanted to interview us, this would be quite nice, actually.